About a year ago, I had this theory that the pelvis does not actually rotate. So I really didn't know where I was going with that, but I just was learning things about the actual just structure and function of a pelvis and just the way joint by joint things work from basically the ankle all the way up to the ilium and the sacrum and then like the lumbar spine. And in my mind, I was trying to make some outlandish claim that the pelvis doesn't actually rotate. What I did come across was something that's really important that not a lot of people talk about, but it's just really the role of hip extension in throwing and how walking cycles, sprinting cycles, and the ability of the hip to go through as limited compensation as possible to create hip extension, how hip extension plays a huge role in throwing and just the way it can set up torso rotation rather than focusing on trying to get the pelvis to turn and rotate to a certain angle is actually trying to be able to time up the ability for our hip to reach near end range max hip extension and time that move up with our ability to rotate our torso. So to explain hip extension is if we take a neutral pelvis, it doesn't tilt forward, it doesn't tilt back, it stays neutral. It's just the femur being able to glide back behind the pelvis. So roughly about 0 to 20 degrees of range motion. Basically, everybody does not have a full 20 degrees. Everybody's going to have to compensate to some degree, but it's basically just the femur rolling back behind the pelvis. So we look at the limb arc model on the right. We have anything of the femur going behind the pelvis equals an IR bias, which is just equaling hip extension. Anything in front up to 60 degrees is early ER. Then we have 60 to 90 degrees, 100 degrees IR. Then we have late going back into ER. So if anybody doesn't know what the limb arc model is, that's basically what it is saying is 0 to 60 ER. It's just a transition of ER, IR to ER, and how that works with like walking, ranges of motion of flexion, and then also how it works with hip extension. So we look at how posture can affect hip extension. Posture is just basically our body trying to find its neutral state and spinal alignments with the pelvis to be able to create a straight line from our ear to our shoulder to our hip down to the ground. So our body is just trying to battle gravity through our path of least resistance and also try to create some propulsion strategies just because our number one form of locomotion is to walk. So our body's compensating through gravity and its fight against it, and then just to find the path of least resistance to get us to flow through space as easy as possible. Since human nature is just to be lazy, we want to burn as limited calories as possible. So compensatory strategies here, anything joint above, joint below is going to work to find positions of the body that we might not have. So the reason why this matters in hip extension is if we have a forward pelvis, that is a compensation for a lack of hip extension. So to pull a femur here, we push our pelvis forward into anterior tilt, we open up more range of motion for our femur to glide behind us. So we have somebody with an extended low back and an anteriorly tilted pelvis. They're trying to bias that movement for creating more hip extension, more internal rotation there. And they're obviously dumping their pelvis forward. So that's getting into the more hip extension position, more hip extended position as well. People go into posterior tilt, they're kind of doing the opposite. They're trying to bias tucked pelvis. So we take the femur here, tuck our pelvis. Now we have more space to go into more hip flexion. So people with a flat back are doing the opposite of people with sway back or people with a kyphotic lordotic posture. So looking at posture and hip extension are just like some compensations of what we're trying to accomplish. So ultimately, the main goal is for our bodies to produce force. We have to produce force when we're walking. We have to produce force sprinting at a higher rate, jumping, throwing, literally anything that we're trying to do in our fight against gravity is us trying to produce force. So ways to produce force, just creating interrotation, exhalation, compression. All three of those are the same thing. We wanted to simplify it. It's all interrotation. We need interrotation, produce force. So looking at this picture on the right is just a natural compensation of what people will do to try to produce that force. So we're going to cave the knees in, which is going to create more tibial interrotation, more ankle dorsiflexion, more ankle eversion. It's also going to propel us into more femoral interrotation, pelvic into rotation. Now we can capture all that to push us out. And that's the main way for somebody to produce a lot of force with jumping, not only in broad jumps, but vertical jumps. Sprinting, they're going to go out to in and use this technique called the win-loss mechanism. But another thing that I wanted to point out too with posture is, so if we dump our pelvis forward, go from this way, we dump our pelvis forward, our acetabulum, so this rim that the femur sits into, stays in the same spot, but the acetabulum is moving on the femur. So we are biasing pelvic motion in all planes, if this femur stays the same, to create more movement strategies or to open up more degrees of freedom or to compensate for a previous injury. So it's not that we are moving our femur, our pelvis is actually responding to other sensory like organs basically to respond to movement to find our path of least resistance, and the pelvis is moving on the femur. The femur isn't creating the movement and the pelvis moves. Pelvis is moving, lumbar spine moving, things above are moving, and then the femur is going to follow. So to briefly hit on this zone of apposition, since this works with posture as well, there's a thoracic diaphragm, which is basically this J hook here, pelvic diaphragm, which is our pelvic floor almost. Those two things need to be on top of each other. This is creating a stacking. When we have a rib flare, we're going to extend forward and create more of a less spinal curve. We're going to flat back everything from the lumbar to the thoracic, and then we're going to have a forward head. So that's not being stacked. Being stacked is basically taking a huge exhale, getting all of our air out. So both of our diaphragms can stack on top of each other. Now our rib cage can expand, it can compress. We can create external rotation, abduction. We can get things to move away from the body. We can get things to move back in versus being stuck in one posture. You can't go, I think the saying from Conor Harris is you can't go more north when you're already at the North Pole. So basically, if you put yourself into a certain position that is very extreme, you can't go any more into that spot. Versus if you're stacked, you're neutral, you can go anywhere, you have all the degrees of freedom in the world. And then the hit on gait briefly, since I'm going to talk about that when we go into throwing. There is 3 main phases. There's also a swing phase that breaks this down deeper, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next slide. But if we just break it into 3 main phases, we have heel strike, mid stance, and then toe off. We talk about the limb arc model again, just taking our right side only here. Heel strike is pelvis kind of tucking, femur coming forward. So we're in early phase there. So we're in less than 60 degrees of hip flexion. So we're in ER. Then we come back. Femur gets right underneath us. We're in mid stance. Everything is basically stacked. We start to internally rotate a little bit, and then we push ourselves to the other side. We're going both ways here. We go left side is going early stance, then mid stance, then late stance. Basically, the pelvis is working like a windshield wiper with the sacrum, twisting both ways. And where this really going to matter is just understanding that when we're in heel strike on one side, toe off on the other side, or late stance on the other side, we're creating a giant twist and dissociating our pelvis. So we can maximize hip extension. We can maximize our ability to create rotation, not only from our pelvis, but up into our torso as well. Since once we extend our hip, our arm is going to swing forward. Now we're timing up thoracic rotation with our back hip extending. And that is basically what walking is. So one thing about walking, if you were just to cue, take the biggest arm swing possible, you are going to swing spine more and probably delay the hip going behind you more, or create more range of motion of the hip going behind you, if I'm saying that right. Basically, you swing your arm more, right arm forward more, it's going to create more range of motion for our right hip to go into more extension. And then now we're creating greater propulsion strategies, since we're staying in extension a little bit longer, where we have more range of motion to push ourselves into our left leg. So right leg back, right arm forward, left arm back, left leg forward. Now we have more range of motion to push into the other side. So where hip extension becomes really important is that it's the final push out of our opposite side. So mid stance is this guy standing vertical here. That is when we're producing our most ground reaction forces into the ground. This is where basically vertical, everything's going down. And then off of that, the next move is to create hip extension, right arm swing, torso rotation, get into the left hip. It's the final transition of us producing force and transitioning into the opposite side. Also, like I mentioned, we're in early stance on one side when we're in late stance on the other, vice versa. They go both ways. That's going to maximize pelvic relative motion. Taking the pelvis here, it's a twist. Early stance on the left, late stance on the right. and then we go back into mid stance, and then we switch to the other way. Pelvis is rotating. You can literally see as I do that, pelvis is rotating. So we maximize rotation, not only from our pelvis, but our thoracic spine, when we maximize the ability to go into hip extension on one side, external rotation, and early hip flexion on the other side, which is basically throwing, go walk, swing your arms as much as you can. It's going to feel like you're actually like doing the turn of what a lasso drill might be, or a roll in. You're creating rotation, not only from separating your pelvis and dissociating it, but also transitioning that from the ground up into the upper body. So let's take a couple throwers here, all completely different. So here we have Brewstar, and with Brewstar, he is a big wide guy. He's going to want to produce force quick, get into IR, and descend things and compress things very quick. So you can see as he comes out of leg lift, maximizes his ability to basically get pelvis, thoracic, spine stacked. Everything is in a good spot, starting to internally rotate a little bit from his foot getting into mid stance, his tibia starting to internally rotate, knee underneath the hip, and then toe off and turn there. So big thing to see here is once his knee starts getting behind that hip, his arm is going to be in a spot to rotate from, and then his thoracic spine is going to be sent off of that, and the pelvis is basically going to be dead. Backside pelvis dead, front side trying to transition and gather all that weight and stop it. So he's going from hip extension here, thoracic rotation, dropping that right hip and scissoring that back leg to try to maximize his ability to stop the pelvis on the lead leg. So all of that energy can get set up, and he's trying to do that before max external rotation. So here, internal rotation, scissor, drop the right hip, use hip extension to time up torso rotation. And then once that's finished, we're trying to stop all that energy with the lead leg. So Class A does a similar thing. All these guys are actually going to do similar things, but we take Class A. He's a little bit more narrow, so he's going to use more range of motion to try to produce force. He has to create space away from his body to then create expansion, so he can then have more room to drop things back down. So Class A, as he comes out of leg lift, creates a big IR strategy. Once again, he's getting into a form of mid stance where his inside heel, his inside arch, and then his first mat head, the ball of his big toe, are all getting into the ground. Tucks his pelvis slightly, creates a little bit of counter turn there. Also hikes up the lead side of his pelvis a little bit to also bias a little bit more internal rotation by dropping that right hip again. And then as he starts working forward, he gets into this similar spot where he's still in mid stance on the back leg, but he's just in a greater position to now try to toe off. And one thing that I had a conversation with Emilio Martinez about was, in theory, Emilio Class A's pelvis angle by the time he plants is late. Get rid of Siri up here. Siri gone. So having a conversation with Emilio Martinez, I completely had a thought that Class A's pelvis was late. So by the time he gets into foot strike and bears weight on that front side, his pelvic angle is a little bit more closed off than, say, like 45 degrees from like most of the driveline studies. Is that what they see is like between like 40, 50 degrees, you're finding that the pelvic angle is open enough to create enough separation to have a gap to close off of. Class A is interesting because, like I said, he's more narrow. He has to create a lot more space away from his body to produce force. So looking at this, he has a ton of lumbar extension. Pelvis is going to a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt, or just relative motion of how his body is working. It's all starting to like kind of dump forward, which is going to free up more range of motion for his back leg to work behind him. So he's going to have a little bit more hip extension bias there. And also he's going to have more range of motion for his arm to get into horizontal abduction. So going back to what I was trying to say about Class A and me and Emilio having a conversation was looking at his torso angle. So his pelvis is basically like side to side, maybe a couple degrees open. Torso angle is more counter rotated. So he's biasing a lot of extension, not only at the lumbar spine, but at the thoracic spine, to not only bypass some maybe lack of range of motion of true hip extension at the pelvis, but also just to create more of a larger force production window. So he's just creating a ton of space, giving himself a ton of time to produce force as he gets his arm deep, travel back, And from that counter rotated position, he's basically using a ton of spine and just using compensations to create as good of a pelvis as he possibly can. Push that again, full speed. Just very spinal torque and very fast upper half. Like his spine is elite. I think he does a really good job of just timing up his compensations with using a wet spine and also having a pretty elite pelvis. So DeGrom's a little bit of an anomaly. He is just a really good mover. He has a ton of range of motion or compensates through his range of motion very distinctly, where like honestly you can't see it, I guess to say. But looking at DeGrom again, the principle is very similar, where he's getting into mid stance in that back leg, being able to hold the foot contacts of what a mid stance would be, and then he's getting ankle dorsiflexion, tibial internal rotation, femoral internal rotation, pelvic internal rotation as he's working forward, getting into toe off. One theory I was thinking of, and I didn't do too much research on looking at old video DeGrom, but I believe he's starting to cut himself off a little bit more, striding slightly cross body, maybe a few inches, which might be a compensation for something, or him trying to change what Corey Wilder thinks is his lead leg. But basically, DeGrom gets into a really good position without using a ton of anterior tilt, without using a ton of low back extension. It looks like the way he gets there is a little bit more of like a true wave rather than Clase. You can see him kind of like out forcing it, but getting into it early. Looking at DeGrom here, he's able to stay stacked with his pelvis working underneath his shoulders, from kind of working up, and until the last second, his low back doesn't really extend. But again, once his knee travels behind his hip, his arm's going to be in a spot to rotate from if I can get it. So knee traveling behind his hip, his torso is completely closed or completely sideways, pelvis is working through. Now, as he rotates and turns, that back leg is basically maxed out in extension. So the back side of the pelvis is done. Just trying to push out as much as you can so the lead leg can stop all that energy again and maximize its ability to close off from early stance to try to transition back into mid stance by time ball release is happening. So DeGrom, limited compensations, does a lot of things really well. Clase has some compensations, does things pretty well again, but uses a little bit more of a spinal compensation. Bruce Starr, completely wide guy, so he's going to do it in different ways, but he's able to produce internal rotation forces very quickly and also still use hip extension to time up torso rotation. Then we go into one of my guys, so Mitch Morrell. He has one of the most electric assessments I've ever seen. Electric in the way that he just could do literally anything with his body. Really didn't have any limitations, didn't have a lot of nagging history of things, like really no injury history in general. So with him, it was basically like, we need to optimize the way that your body is basically built. Your body and brain are basically built to throw hard. It's not that you need to be forced to do anything or get into these set positions. Your body can basically do anything. You have all the degrees of freedom in the world. So we really just need to have a principle of trying to get your body to maximize that, which our principle was to try to just produce as much, not produce, but capture as much momentum as possible. Stay stacked, get your center of mass moving forward, and kind of let yourself organize off of that. And what we really came to was just like doing step backs, doing walk windups, doing a Kuchi type drill. And then from there, he kind of just figured it out, was able to get this pitch up to 97. But if we take a look at the way Mitch moves, he moves through a ton of range of motion. He's very calm early. This was played out real quick. Very calm early, aggressive late. I know that pitch was sailed. I don't care. But take Mitch in the leg lift. Calm, not too high of a leg lift, hand staying like relatively to the body. And as he drops down and gets into his load, he's once again maximizing mid stance, pelvis like relatively tucked, using a little bit of a dorsiflexion strategy, creating internal rotation there, creating a good foot reference, ground reference with the foot. And then off of that, he's going to toe off and kind of like slide his leg behind him a little bit. So if you can see where he starts and then where he starts to toe off and go, it's kind of swiping the ground underneath him and creating this little scissor move. But once again, like Clase, And like I mentioned about Mitch, he has an electric movement assessment. His body has a ton of range of motion, a lot of room for slack. He uses a little bit of Class A's move where kind of rotates the torso, gets the pelvis to a position where it's relatively open, but not completely open to the degrees that maybe we're necessarily looking for. And then from there, drops the right hip and closes the cap. So he uses a ton of hip extension since he has it, but he times it up really well and slides that back leg behind him to really kind of just create rotational energy by extending the hip and sending that upper half forward and being able to block aggressively into that lead leg. Once again, by scissoring that back leg, by dropping that right hip, and by being able to time up extension with torso rotation. So like I mentioned, a lot of this goes to just like theory of like pelvis not actually rotating, like what's actually driving pelvic rotation. It's really just kind of walking in a frontal plane movement. Like we're going from a transition of us trying to hold mid stance for as long as possible and then toe off. And that lead leg is going to go into the opposite side. Since we're toeing off, we're going into late stance on the back leg. We need to go into early stance on the front leg, and then front leg kind of transitions to mid stance. This may not make sense, but this is kind of where my brain's at, understanding how me learning gait was like, maybe this works with throwing. And this is how I'm kind of articulating it. So we'll take it for what it is. But I think there's definitely some truth there and some validity. I think just watching guys throw, you can kind of see it. But we just need to maximize, not necessarily walking. We just need to kind of alter people's changes of creating a better path of least resistance, which in my idea is you open up hip extension, people have more room to produce force, more room to transfer the force that they put into the ground in mid stance. Since now they're on the final stage of pushing off, you have more hip extension, you have more range of motion to produce force from a larger arc. Not everybody needs that. Bruce Starr, if you try to give him hip extension, like maybe it helps him a little bit, just be healthier, but ultimately he's already found the way of optimizing what he has. So more is not necessarily better, but the timing of it is very critical. If you have more hip extension, you can be like Mitch and just figure out a million different ways to try to throw a ball and accomplish it, being an elite level compensator there. But that's what I got for this video. Leave any questions you might have in the comments, or just reach out to me, send me a DM, send me a text, whatever it may be. But I appreciate everybody watching.